All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get this started. Thank you for joining. I am Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney. You are joining us for another edition of Committee for Sydney Live. The topic today, a fair recovery for New South Wales, featuring Jodi McKay, Member of Parliament and Leader of the Opposition for Strathfield. Jodi McKay has been leader in Parliament since June of 2019, originally elected in 2007 as a member for Newcastle. She rose to hold several ministerial portfolios, including tourism, women, commerce, small business, and science and medical research. Prior to becoming leader of the opposition, she was shadow minister for transport and roads. This will be a conversation where you can ask anything you want. She is used to that in this role, having to take on all topics. And you know how this works. You can submit questions via the Q&A app on Zoom, and I will sort through them. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriel. And can I just thank everyone for coming on? Who would have thought that we'd be doing a speech like this by webinar? But I do want to start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, paying my respects to elders past and present. And you mentioned the date, of course, when I became leader. So it's almost a year. I've almost had 12 months as leader of the Labor Party. And what a 12 months it's actually been. I want to just start by saying that obviously we're in really extraordinary times right now, and I think it's a tribute to how well we've adapted that I'm not sitting there having lunch with you. I'm actually here in Parliament House in front of a computer screen talking to you. I think our success as Australians at turning back COVID-19 has been due to a huge community effort, and I want to just say thank you to all of you as well for the role that you have played in making sure that we come out of this better than many other nations. Life is, of course, slowly returning to normal, and that really hit home to me when I was in my electorate late last week at Sydney Markets, which I'm very fortunate to represent in the Parliament. And I can tell you that so many people were really thrilled to be back, and it's been terrific. But I do want to today politely point out that New South Wales is the only state in Australia that doesn't actually have a roadmap to recovery. I wrote to the Premier back on May 8th, and I asked that the government tell the community the stages of opening, including when restrictions will be lifted or in fact eased. Right now, as many of you know, we have approximately 50 people who can be in a corporate box at the footy. We have about 20 people who can attend a wedding. One day we have protests that are allowed, the next day they're not allowed. And today, of course, we've got the Deputy Premier who's out advocating for 40,000 fans at the NRL. There has been chaos and confusion, and I think right now people are feeling that. They're unsure why decisions are being made and when decisions that impact them that they're desperately hoping for will be made. Everyone from our churches through to our community groups to the arts and live music, I think will need ongoing guidance as these restrictions are eased, and we're certainly supportive of the government providing that, but I have been and remain an advocate for a roadmap to recovery, and as I said, we're the only state that doesn't have that. I think we must also be honest and say that our state has been disproportionately hit hardest, not only by the number of COVID-19 case numbers, but we've had a series of what I would call economic convulsions that few people would have thought possible. Certainly in my leadership, when I accepted the leadership a year ago, I never thought we'd be battling drought, which we already knew, but then bushfires, then a pandemic, and of course now a recession. As an opposition, we have sought during this pandemic to be constructive, so to agree with the government when we thought that there was something positive that they were putting forward. But I've also indicated that where I have a different idea or I think that we need to do things differently, that I would also weigh in and ensure that our ideas were being put forward and we were advocating for those that were being left behind. I think that there is an opportunity for us right now as we're emerging from this pandemic to kind of reimagine New South Wales. And I have to say, I see a great role for the Committee for Sydney in doing this, because you've got so many great thinkers that are members of the organisation, and you've always led on being really innovative in this space. I think Jacinda Ardern said, and I may get this quote wrong, but I think she said something like, it's an extraordinary time and we should be willing to consider extraordinary ideas. So I challenge each and every one of you to think about how we move into what will be a new normal. And there will be a new paradigm. And I think we need to consider what we want to keep and what we don't want to keep. We're all working from home, for instance, and Zoom calls and webinars like this, will they become a permanent feature? I spoke to our young Labor group the other night, and I said to them, if we can do a Zoom every night, I would be really happy to engage with you very, very regularly. And I think that most people probably feel that way. If less people are traveling, then how do we adapt our public transport? Will we see online learning become more popular and indeed far more sophisticated? But I think this pandemic has also highlighted what I see as structural weaknesses, and it's laid those bare. So we've had people like casuals and freelancers, we've had those on a visa, we've had international students who've really fallen through the cracks, and I think there are real lessons for us to learn out of this pandemic to ensure that we do everything possible to make sure that no one is actually left behind. And of course, I do want to mention women, because they have borne the brunt of job losses in sectors like retail and hospitality. And right now, we do not have a plan to get women back to work. We are really eager, as I said, to open a conversation with the Committee for Sydney and all of those online tonight or today to actually achieve that. But I think I need to start at what is the obvious, and that is that these are really desperate and difficult economic times. Many people, as you know, have lost a job or a business. For some, it's been very, very difficult to just put food on the table. I had a woman who posted on my Facebook yesterday, and it really struck me because I was talking actually about international students, and I want to cover more of that shortly. But she posted on my Facebook to say that, her husband had recently lost his job of 20 years, that after tax they have $650 a week from the JobKeeper program that pays for her family's food, it pays for medical, it pays for their mortgage. And it's been really, really difficult for her and many others. And these are the real stories that we actually need to consider when we talk about economic recovery and the role of government. We can't leave these people behind, and right now they are being left behind. I think that this financial stress is also being compounded by social isolation, and I think we need to consider what that actually means. We're all in this together, I know, but sometimes there are some people who've never felt more alone during this particular period. Last month, of course, we had more than 200,000 people who lost their job in New South Wales, and it's been confirmed that New South Wales has in fact led the country into recession. We've also had thousands more who've just left the workforce completely. So our priority, as is the government's priority, has to be about stimulating the economy and generating jobs. We have to be growing our economy. As you would have heard, we've taken a different position to the government on their wage cut or wage freeze. We believe that it's bad economics to actually, recession to hurt what is demand. So we want to see the 2.5% pay increase, which has been in government policy since 2011. In fact, it's in legislation. And you would have seen during the last sitting of Parliament that the government had to move a regulation, which we then disallowed. But it has been in law since 2011. Our approach is, of course, backed by the Reserve Bank Governor. It's backed by people like Ross Gittins. It's backed by the Grattan Institute for the Centre for Future Work. And I do want to just say that it's really important in acknowledging that we have 410,000 public servants in this state, many of them in rural and regional New South Wales. And when we think of stimulus and how we stimulate demand in this state, we can't just think of Sydney. It's really important to understand that all of New South Wales is in this. And we have international tourism and international students. We have our trade that's been impacted. And so we are certainly advocating for demand, a demand-led recovery. I think businesses also need certainty, and we have been very active in asking Dominic Perrottet, the Treasurer, to present an economic statement to the Parliament. It was my hope that he would do that during the first sitting week that we had back, which, let me say, was a very odd week when we only have 9 on the front bench in the opposition during question time. It's certainly a much quieter place. So we've got Parliament next week, so I encourage you to log on and actually have a look. Maybe you won't stay on for too long because it is very quiet. But we've been asking him to give an economic statement, and Josh Frydenberg did this federally, and I think it's really important that for business confidence and certainty that we actually get that here in New South Wales. What we know so far is that revenue has fallen by about 10 to 20 billion, but we don't know much else. And I think it's really important that we actually find out what the state of the budget is and the economy. I think it's incredibly important, as I said, for confidence and for business certainty. We have also said that we will engage with the government on taxation reform, and Dominic Perrottet has mentioned, he's mentioned land tax and payroll tax, and we're really happy to engage in a conversation on both those. We've been very keen to see the proposals that they will put forward, and I've spoken to you a number of times, and as you know, I've been a fairly strong advocate for value capture, and I do despair that we've had all these infrastructure projects and the government still hasn't been able to nail value capture. And I note that the Productivity Commission this week was pushing that as well. But I do remain a strong advocate for value capture, which is just beyond the Section 94 contributions, of course. We have had, as I said, tried to have a very constructive role in this pandemic, but there are ideas and policies that we've put forward, and I just want to run through some of those with you today. We'll be only brief, and I'm more than happy to take questions on any of them. But I think that today's front page of the Herald reminds us that we can't just be focusing on an economic stimulus that is actually about really large projects only. And that's so far as what we've heard from the government. We can have economic stimulus in a rural and regional community that is just about fixing a pothole by using local workers and local tradespeople. We have $3.8 billion worth of projects that the government hasn't yet got out the door. And we do want to see a focus on what local government can do here and how we support local communities. And again, I keep coming back to the fact that sometimes our rural and regional communities just get forgotten when we talk about these very large projects which the government wants to focus on. I do think that we need business certainty, as I said, and confidence, and I just want to praise the government for the announcement on the Western Sydney Airport Metro. I think that's a really important project, and I was very pleased to finally see the Prime Minister cough up some money because we haven't had dollars put into too many, if any, infrastructure projects, any of those major infrastructure projects. There just hasn't been federal money. And if there's one project where I would personally welcome federal government intervention financially, it is actually with the Western Metro. And I know you've been a huge supporter of that for the Committee for Sydney, and I'll talk further about that as well. We agree with the Premier that redirecting the funds from ANZ Stadium is important at this time. And you would have heard me many times say that I do believe that the money from the Powerhouse Museum should be redirected as well. I think that that is an unpopular project. I think that the government should be doing something different other than just moving that museum to Parramatta. It doesn't mean we're against a world-class cultural arts and heritage precinct. We are not. We believe that Parramatta should have that, but certainly $1.5 billion is not what we support. I keep coming back whenever I speak to people about what the Premier said in the lead up to the election, and she said, you know, we could have it all, and we cannot have it all. We absolutely cannot have it all. And we do have to be honest about what projects will be retained and what will actually go. And as I said, I think it's really important that with Western Metro and Parramatta Light Rail Stage 2 in particular, that we know what the government's plans will be. I despair, and I've said this to you many times, I despair that we're seeing no attention, for instance, put on that Olympic Park precinct. We have communities right across Sydney that complain about high-rise development, yet the one place where people want high-rise development and support high-rise development is actually Sydney Olympic Park. And I just despair that we're not going to see transport there until the late 2020s, and that's just not good enough. So I do want to know how Western Metro will be funded. We support that project, and I know you've been very active as a Committee for Sydney, engaging in the whole issue around whether it should be a faster rail versus more stops. So I think it's really important that we actually think about issues like that. I also, when we talk about stimulus, I do want to also mention schools. So we actually think that building schools creates jobs as well, and we've got 100 projects that the government hasn't actually fast-tracked, 100 projects they've promised, which have no money attached to it, and certainly no timeline. So I was yesterday at the Ponds and Oran Park, and also at Gregory Hills, and if you haven't been there, I encourage all of you to visit those areas, because you will get to see the massive challenges faced by growth in Sydney and some of the infrastructure issues that do need to be addressed. And schools is just one of those. This is where mums and dads live. This is where mums and dads are, and where they're now, they're facing enormous challenges around infrastructure just not keeping up with growth. So schools remains a priority for us with stimulus, and Daniel Andrews announced a $1.2 billion stimulus package, and I would love to see that here. Our fourth principle that I want to just mention is something that touches everyone, but the government has focused much of its attention on construction on big projects. I mentioned smaller projects, these screwdriver-ready projects that we need to also look at. But we do need a more holistic approach, I think, to how we want to be as a state and what our competitive advantage is. And we would love to see a whole Made in New South Wales campaign. You know, Victoria did this years ago. Here we've offshored many of in fact, all our major transport projects, from light rail to metro, our ferries, our buses, they've all been offshored. And we are the largest customer here in New South Wales. And I do believe we should be using the procurement power of government to actually look at how we support manufacturing jobs in Sydney, in Western Sydney, in the Illawarra, in the Hunter, and in areas on the mid-north coast where these jobs traditionally were located. I was pleased to actually hear that Andrew Constance recently indicated that he is unsure why so many of those transport jobs are actually offshored, and whether that was in fact the right decision, which we've been saying for a very long time. So I think whether it's a new school or a fleet of buses, or whether we're sourcing, components, I do think there's the opportunity to actually back our own entrepreneurs and companies here. I think we also have to see more than just male-dominated industries supported. Construction is important, and women are employed in construction, but we have to also focus not just on construction in Sydney, but in rural and regional areas. And we have to focus on women. As I said when I started, how do we get women back to work? What are the jobs for women? I actually think that it's one of the most important, singly important stimulus ideas that we can have, is just to get women back to work. And I was so disappointed that the federal government has actually flagged that it's going to walk away from its childcare on July 12th, and we're urging the New South Wales government to continue its focus on childcare here. If you are aware of what happens in the childcare industry, it's basically community and council-run preschools that New South Wales is focused on. To their credit, they've put money in that, and we do ask them to continue to do that. I think we also need a tourism reboot. I was the tourism minister for some time, and I know how important important that is. We know, of course, that we're not going to see international tourists for a very long time, but there is the opportunity, I think, to invest more in domestic tourism. We've got money sitting there through Destination New South Wales. We should be using that money. We support the easing of travel restrictions, but I think that telling people just to go travel to New South Wales is not good enough. I want to see residents experience the story of New South Wales. There's never been a better time to do this. Not only do we need to, I think, promote our Sydney CBD attractions, but there are suburbs like Cabramatta that have amazing Vietnamese food, and there Bankstown. You've got places like Harris Park where you've got the shops and the eateries, and just incredible areas that people here in Sydney should know about. And of course, we've got our regional and rural communities, our outback, so places in the far north coast like Lismore. It's just beautiful still at this time of the year. And of course, our outback communities, as I mentioned, that have their own story to tell. I think that there's an opportunity for us to really reimagine Sydney more than we've ever done before. Someone said to me the other day that we could look at a renaissance in springtime once we get through winter. But I think that, we do need new eyes on what Sydney and New South Wales can be. And I spoke about that new paradigm, that new normal. And, I think that's the challenge for us going forward. I think that many people have been afforded a new perspective on life. They've got to know their family, their husband, their wife. But as I said, there are many who've been left behind. And I don't think any of us should underestimate the great struggle that so many in our community are actually facing right now. I actually think we'll see more people working from home. When I was in Gregory Hills yesterday, a gentleman who works in real estate was telling me that, his wife has been working from home, and because you can't use the elevators in the CBD, we haven't worked out how to do that. They're now looking at how you can actually have people working from home more. If it's not working from home, I think that this will actually make us work closer to home. And that's terrific because, that's been the government's catch cry since 2011. And it does make sense. It makes enormous sense that we're actually taking pressure off our roads and public transport. But in that vein, apart from Parramatta, there's been very little achieved. I mentioned Sydney Olympic Park. That was supposed to be a place for great job generation, not just living, which is what I spoke about. But we need to be able to see other places, not just Parramatta, supported. And I desperately wish that this government would value heritage. It just as an aside, the Royal Oaks Hotel was demolished this week. They're going to demolish Willow Grove. We actually have to be acknowledging the new and the old, and that it works so perfectly well if we get it right. So I want to see areas like Blacktown and Liverpool and Penrith and Campbelltown. I want to see areas like Bankstown, Hurstville and Sutherland. These are towns or these are cities that have great potential. And we also have our great regional cities. So I think we need to look at how we transform some of these areas into exciting hubs for jobs and innovation. And I want to see us prioritizing, and this has been something that has been mentioned numerous times, but there's never been a perfect opportunity than right now to look at those startup hubs and those co-working spaces. And perhaps it's about incentivizing, our developers to look at more co-locating of commercial office space in residential buildings. The other issue I just want to touch on is in regard to public transport. I know this is something that you've also been involved in as a committee, but if we're going to see more people working from home, and I think we will, how that looks, I don't know right now, but I think that is, as I said, one of those new issues that will emerge. We actually have to look at what public transport is going to be like, and just telling people to avoid public transport, I don't think is necessarily the answer. The World Health Organization recently changed its advice on face masks. I'm actually an advocate for that. Chris Minns, our Shadow Transport Minister, has been pushing that for weeks now, that we should be encouraging people to use face masks on public transport, and I really wish the government would adopt that. I also think that we need to really capitalise on the community's great thirst for fresh air, and I know, Gabrielle, you in particular have been a great advocate for cycling and active transport, and when I appointed the Shadow Ministry, I appointed our first Minister for Active Transport transport, because it's something we also believe in. And I think, you know, now is the right time for us to be pushing that as well. But I also think that the stories that we tell, I mentioned the stories of New South Wales, you know, we tell them in words and colour, and we tell them in sculpture and song, in drama and in music, and that's what makes us so special. But our artists and our young people have really been left behind in this pandemic. We also appointed, or I also appointed, John Graham as our Shadow Minister for the nighttime economy. We are the only party to have that too. And that's because it's so important that we look at a vibrant nighttime economy. And you've heard me again, not just here in Sydney, but in those places I mentioned before out west. We have to do better than just regulating alcohol. We have to reinvigorate our live music scene. We have to open our laneway spaces and our public footpaths. We have to reimagine Sydney, as I said, and there's a perfect time to do that, not just during the day, but at night as well. And that should start with a night commissioner, which we've been pushing for a very long time, let me tell you. I also, one of the last things I just want to push is in regard to, you know, how we re-emerge from this pandemic as a global centre of education. We have terrific universities in New South Wales, but it does pain me terribly that we are the only state in this country not to have supported international students. I have been on and on and on about this for weeks, and I will continue to highlight this, because if it wasn't for our multicultural communities and our church groups, we would be in a very, very desperate way right now with international students, because the government has not stepped up at all. I have spent many weekends with community groups, our multicultural groups, our church groups, and they are providing meals to international students. That is the desperate way these students are in. So I saw Tim Reardon's comments. I know he spoke to you yesterday, but this kind of corridor of opening up New South Wales again to international students. We are not looking after the students who are here. This is not just an economic issue for us. It is actually a humanitarian issue, and one I feel very, very strongly about. And let me tell you, we have suffered enormous reputational damage. I have spoken to many students. They are angry, they feel let down, and their experience of studying here has not been positive at all. You have to remember that they were amongst the first to lose their casual jobs. They're just a few weeks at uni, so they're largely isolated from other students. They've not been able to afford food. Their accommodation is precarious and insecure. Many of them are facing very significant issues with visas, and some of them don't even have computers. Their parents in India, and I'm talking only about the subcontinent students right now, but they've saved their entire lifetime to get these young people to study in a country like Australia, and we've just let them down so very terribly, and I despair over that. It is a harsh truth, but I think given the government is now looking at opening up a corridor, and I've said this publicly many times, it's an industry worth $14 billion to this state, and it is the last thing that we have actually thought about. And I encourage Tim Reardon, I encourage the Premier, I encourage the Minister with carriage of this portfolio to do what I have done, to go to these community groups of a weekend to help them feed these students and to actually talk to the students, because this is a dire situation that these students face. I will keep raising that issue. As I said, it's a harsh reality, but I think that we have to offer practical and real support to these students. And today, of course, we hear that China is now recommending that students don't travel here to actually study. So where are the messages of support for these students? You know, it's all about getting them here so that they spend $50,000 on their university course. They want to come here because we are a welcoming country, because we offer so many opportunities. But we have to send these messages of support. And if this is the message they're getting from China, then we need to talk directly to these students to make sure that they know that this is, in fact, a safe place and they will always be supported. I represent one of the most significant Chinese Australian communities in New South Wales. And I know in a very real way that, there is racism there, and these students have also been impacted by that. I'm not going to weigh into these issues in a federal sense, because that's not my role as a state leader, but it is my role to highlight the very real impact on international students. It may be of interest to actually know that Victoria has it's a $45 million package that they've put together. So every international student gets about $1,100. And that, let me tell you, would pay for some rent, but it would also help these students get a meal, at least more than one meal a day. I've also been a very strong advocate. I was the Minister for Science and Medical Research. So I think that, while we're looking at how we supplement the income for our universities, we should be advocating for a research fund that brings us back to where I started, about making sure that we've got an industry here where we've got manufacturing local, but we could see this kind of relationship between our universities and our industry, between business, and it's about creating jobs, but we're using again our local entrepreneurs and the research that we have through our universities. There's just so much potential there, and while that is not normally a space for state governments, I think that if it was about generating jobs locally, that there is great opportunity for us. So that's just a few of the opportunities I see and the issues that I've been speaking very publicly about for a long time. But I do want to say that I know that this is a very tough time for New South Wales, and the decisions that we make, the opportunities that are there that we grasp, we must always make sure that there are not people who are left behind. And right now, this is not a fair recovery, and I desperately believe we need a fair recovery. We need to make sure that it's not just focused on one section of the population in one area. We actually need to recognise that there are women and men who've been impacted, white collar and blue collar, older and young, those who live in the CBD and the suburbs, in city and the country, and they all deserve attention from government. So we're going to work with the government as well as what we can, but where there are issues where we disagree, you will see me as opposition leader speaking out. I do feel passionately about many of these issues, but I do want to say thank you to you all for having your lunchtime with me today and listening to what I have to say. It's great that 2.5 years from an election, you are interested in what the opposition has to say. So thank you very much to you, Gabrielle, and to the committee.
Well, great. Thank you very much. And wow, that is a lot of material to work with, and I can already see a bunch of questions coming in. And I should say that at the committee, this issue about taking care of the international students who are here already is something we've been quite worried about. And,
yeah.
and you can really see that the way Sydney treats the children of other people's children is going to have a huge impact on whether parents want to send their kids here in the future.
I could not agree with you more. I have to say, we have suffered reputational damage, and I think, the government is naive not to actually even acknowledge that. We're the only state in the country that has provided no support. In fact, let me just say to you, the one temporary accommodation support that they have provided, I checked again today, the guidelines haven't even opened. So you can't even apply for it. And that's 3 weeks since they announced it.
All right, first question. The New South Wales budget is going to take a hit. Revenues will be down, and there's going to be borrowing that has to be paid back. How would you propose is the right way to balance the budget going forward?
Yeah, look, can I say that I mentioned in my speech that we've been asking Dominic Perrottet week after week to actually give an economic statement in the Parliament to at least brief us. We wrote over a month ago to ask him to actually brief us about the economic situation and the budget. He's refused to do that. So while we're prepared to work with the government, I think it has to work both ways as well. What we know, as I said, that there's a 10 to $20 billion hit to revenue. We know that he's proposed taxation reform, which we're willing to engage in. And we know that the Premier has proposed or mentioned that the budget is a mess. But that's about it right now. That's about all that we know. And we understand that there will be really challenging times. And I mentioned the priorities that the government has and whether they remain. I think that's a really important issue for us to understand. We're 2.5 years from an election, and there are many questions that we have. So, that's about the only response I'm going to give you today, because right now we don't know the situation with the budget. And I think that, it's not up to me to solve this right now. It's up to me to say that we're willing to work with the government to look at what the solutions are. And I've put what we're willing to do on the table, and I would really like to engage in a discussion on that. I think that's what people expect when we talk about working together. That's the one issue people want us to work together on, and I'm more than happy to do that.
All right, a question about tax reform. Tax reform is on the agenda for two reasons. First, to help maintain fiscal capacity to do all the things government needs to do, which might increase moving forward. Yeah. But also the reason reform is on the agenda is because some taxes are thought to be quite inefficient. Specifically, stamp duty and payroll tax are thought to be quite inefficient. The committee has been an advocate of moving from stamp duty to land tax and from payroll tax to broadening the GST. Would you support either or both of those?
So as I said, we've indicated that we're willing to have this discussion, particularly on land tax and on payroll tax with government. You're right; they're not just inefficient; they're incredibly volatile, and I think we've seen this play out within this pandemic. We also, with stamp duty, you have young people. It prevents young people from entering the market. It prevents older people from downsizing. It's a really inefficient way, and obviously land tax is one of those issues that people are putting forward. Again, it's not up to me to solve this issue, but I have said to the Treasurer that we, tell us what you're proposing, and we will look at that and we will consider that. We do want to see, though, taxation reform that is about fairness, and we want to see taxation reform that allows people to buy a home. We want to see taxation reform that is about growing the economy. So there are some pretty basic principles that we would have when we enter into a discussion with government. In regard to payroll tax, many people see that as anti-business, and Josh Frydenberg was kind of, I think, advocating for a sort of national edict in regard to this, and I would just like to start at a state level, to be honest. Again, a conversation with the Treasurer about this would be really useful. But I mentioned value capture as well, Gabrielle. I know that's something that the Committee for Sydney has advocated. I just think if that's a really wicked problem that if we could crack would be so advantageous to us economically.
I mean, one of the best forms of value recapture is actually a broad-based land tax. It's a very flexible, simple form of value recapture that picks up all kinds of things that government does that increase the value of private land, not just major pieces of infrastructure, but lots of smaller things as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, of course. As I said, I mean, I just outlined the principles that we would apply to any consideration that we have. But I do think I would argue that value capture is still worth us considering, particularly given the number of infrastructure projects that are there. I think there's been an opportunity lost in that regard. And the government has advocated that, but hasn't been able to solve that. So, I acknowledge your comments, but I will still see when you're talking about major infrastructure, they're, for me, two different issues.
A question about climate change. Underneath this idea of Build Back Better, which people all over the world are trying to think through right now, and you alluded to thinking through what do we want to keep and not keep from this experiment we've all been under. One of the most important ways to build back better that a lot of people are talking about is building back greener. And I know the phrase just transition has become controversial, but the notion of a Green New Deal in America, or certainly in Europe, the recovery is being framed as a green recovery, using this as an opportunity to ramp down carbon intensive industries and ramp up non-carbon intensive industries. What would you think are the most fair ways to do that you could get behind?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of work internally right now on this whole decarbonisation, green recovery issue. But I've also thrown energy policy into the mix because I think that, there's some real struggles for us around energy. So I actually would add energy policy to your decarbonisation, green recovery. I'd add that in there as well. Look, I have to say that I actually... I'm really disappointed that we had such a movement around climate change out of the drought and the bushfires, and then we move into a pandemic, and it seems to have taken second place. It seems to have, in some ways, disappeared from the conversations we're having. Although I mentioned this different paradigm, so there is an opportunity for us to discuss this, I think, within the paradigm of jobs, and certainly. There is great opportunity around renewable energy in particular to look at how we generate jobs, and that's work that we're really keen to pursue internally. We're the Labor Party. We're always going to be supportive of strong action on climate change. I just want to pick up, Gabrielle, on that word just transition. I think that is a real problem. I think that word, or those two words, have really mixed up the discussion in this country, particularly here in New South Wales, because the people who work within the coal industry don't necessarily see that they would work within the renewable energy industry. So I think that we've got to be able to acknowledge, that we'll have coal as a baseload power for some time to come, but we do need to take those very difficult decisions around creating jobs and investment in renewable energy. And that's something I feel very, very strongly about. I think that if you're talking about job creation, that there's a terrific opportunity right now to look at renewable energy, and I know that has been put on the table as well federally by federal Labor, but I'm really keen to look at that. But I do think, I have said this: when someone walks into a coal mine, they don't do it because they want to damage the environment. They do it because they're putting food on the table for their family. And I think any discussion on decarbonisation and green recovery needs to actually understand that that's where that person's motivation starts, and we need to be able to address that.
Yeah, I mean, many people have observed that the climate transition is no longer a technical issue. It is a cultural and social issue about certain places may never see their economy recover. And it's probably happening faster than a lot of people realize.
But I think, can I just pick up on that? I think there's opportunity for us here, though, because we know where coal is, we know where energy is, we know the Illawarra, we've got, the Hunter region. So there are areas there that, we can look at kind of local based solutions. There's a lot of work going on in those areas already, but I keep bringing up, I mentioned this manufacturing. If you're going to look at, if you want to use that word just transition, you look at like for like. Someone in a coal industry can actually see themselves working in a manufacturing industry, right? So you've actually got like for like there, but unfortunately, we haven't seen that. I remember when I was member for Newcastle, I remember standing outside Gunninan and when those Waratah trains came off the line there, and the whole community was so proud of those trains that were constructed, and then of course the jobs that were created, and the same with Tom ago, the same with Four Jacks in Newcastle, where you had the ferries and the work that was being done there, and we don't have that. And I think we should be looking at how we do that, how we value those jobs too.
All right, a question has come in about public sector pay increases. Given that so many people are taking deep pay cuts in the private sector, and given that so many people are actually completely unemployed Is it really fair to be giving public sector workers a pay raise?
Well, I come back to the fact that this has been in law since 2011, first of all. So the government brought this in, tried to do this through regulation last Friday, and we worked with the crossbenchers in the upper house to make sure that that was disallowed, that regulation. So the government is now before the commission seeking to change that. So that's the status of it. You know, there are a couple of arguments that I would put here. One is that we have 410,000 people that are employed in the public sector. That's 10% of the workforce here in New South Wales. So whatever decision is made on this is going to impact 10% of the workforce. It's also going to impact rural and regional areas. And you have to remember that when you're in a rural and regional area, a job in the public service is actually a good, well-paying job. And we need to protect those jobs in these communities. And therefore, we need to make sure that people are spending in those communities. You know, our reason for taking this position is about stimulating local demand when we do not have international demand. We don't have our international tourists. We don't have our international students coming in. We don't have trade. You know, we actually have to look at how we're stimulating local demand. And, you know, there are two sides to this argument. And I note when the Treasurer was actually on radio after he first announced they were going to pursue this, that he even admitted that this was something that they had backed as a demand stimulus for a very long time. So we believe it shouldn't be either or. You know, I mentioned the Powerhouse Museum. It comes back to priorities. We are going to have very different priorities to them, particularly priorities that, you know, we lay out there in the lead up to the election. But this is a priority for us. And it's also, you know, we want to see projects like that Powerhouse Museum. You know, the pay rise we're talking about is under $1 billion. That's $1.5 billion to move the Powerhouse Museum. And what do you achieve there? You achieve jobs in Western Sydney in the short term only. So, you know, this is for us, it's non-negotiable, but, you know, as I said, we would love to know what the budget situation is in real terms, and we haven't been able to find that out. It's quite possible that you actually know more than us, Gabrielle.
Interesting idea.
How's you doing this?
Yeah. Jodi, what is your view on the idea of fast rail between Sydney and Newcastle?
Yeah, okay. So look, that has been, you know, proposed for so very long. And I know my federal colleague, Anthony Albanese, is a great proponent of fast rail. I actually believe we need faster rail more so than we need fast rail. So we also pushed for, and I know that the federal government was actually looking at how you fund a number of studies into, I think there were 3 or 4 proposals, and one of those was south to Goulburn and down to the ACT, and we actually put some money in, committed some money to say that we actually wanted to look at faster rail down there. I think it's going to be a long time before we see fast rail, but I do think it's really important that particularly, you know, when you're talking about, you know, these satellite areas, and I was the member for Newcastle and the Minister for the Hunter, satellite areas like the Hunter and even the Central Coast and the Illawarra, that you are looking at how you increase the speed of travel. But I think it is going to be a long time, Gabrielle, before we see fast rail between Newcastle and Sydney. If there was money there, yes. But again, it comes back to priorities. My priority right now, if you were to say the number one project for me, it is public transport, and it is the Western Metro.
All right, a geopolitical question for you, but with a strong Sydney angle, and that's Hong Kong. As the Chinese government has moved to impose control and suspend civil liberties in Hong Kong, there is speculation that many people in Hong Kong may seek to leave. The UK well, Boris Johnson just said he would be open to up to 3 million people moving to the UK from Hong Kong. And a debate has now emerged about whether Australia should be taking steps to take in immigrants from Hong Kong in greater numbers. One presumes many of them would come to Sydney were that to happen. What are your views on this debate?
Oh my goodness, that is such a broad question for a state leader, but I do have views on this debate. So first of all, I think there's the whole issue around immigration. I mean, we're a state and a country built on immigration, and I am a firm advocate for that, but I think it's going to be a very difficult road ahead for us in understanding how that happens. Obviously, the New South Wales works with the federal government in terms of understanding immigration numbers here, but it is largely driven federally. You know, I've always been an advocate for a greater conversation with the federal government around immigration numbers. But you know, it's a hot potato right now, and I think that you know, the federal government and federal Labor are working through any policy differences that they may have. I mentioned that you know, I represent a significant Chinese Australian community, and they're mainland Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese, and I've also got a lot of Taiwanese as well in my electorate. There are a couple of things that I would just have as basic principle here, that you know, we should be a country that in no way would condone violence. I would hope that whatever happens in Taiwan or Hong Kong can be resolved in a peaceful way. I think that is all our desire. We saw, of course, you know, and I'm no way drawing a comparison here, but we saw Australia open its arms and its hearts after Tiananmen Square. So I would hate to think that, you know, we would ever be in that situation again, where we would need to step in from a humanitarian perspective. But you know, it is a conversation that you know, we need to have. I just think that right now, you know, it's probably too early for me to weigh in any more than that, because immigration, you know, we've seen a complete shutdown of whatever is happening, you know, people coming in and out of this country. So perhaps, you know, if that case does arise, I'd be more than happy to provide a greater detail in regard to that.
A couple more questions about the university sector. We're hearing that more than 20,000 jobs, university jobs, are about to go away across the country. It's an absolutely critical sector of the economy that is facing terrible collapse from international students because of the pandemic. What are your views about what can be done to support the sector?
Yeah, so I've had quite a number of conversations with people from different universities. I've made sure that I mentioned that I was the Minister for Science and Medical Research. So when we were in government, I had carriage of university policy, and also put on the first chief scientist. And I helped set up Hunter Medical Research when I was in Newcastle, and also was on the board there of the research cooperative, which was responsible for the translation of research into you know, translational research. Look, I think that, you know, I mentioned some of the structural challenges that have been exposed, and I think the dependence on international students is one of those. I do think that traditionally universities have been seen as a federal issue only. So, you know, the federal government has always put in far more money for capital projects. You know, most of the research grants, even if you look at the old cooperative research centres, or grants to seed grants to medical research or any other research program, has been largely driven by the federal government. New South Wales' role has always been that, you know, very the kind of making universities cooperate, have an outcome, but also look at that seed funding issue. So that's pretty much where we've been limited, I think, in New South Wales. We've always celebrated our universities, but I do think that there is a greater role for state government. I'm not sure whether it's a process of sharing with the feds the sort of capital challenges now, or whether it is about a greater investment in research. What I proposed when I spoke to you was that perhaps it starts with research, which is around using universities and industry to actually look at how we support, you know, those local jobs that I spoke about, that I think we really need to focus on. You know, I was very pleased that the Premier, in the middle of this pandemic, actually put a call out to local manufacturers to see who could retool to actually provide PPE, and I think that was terrific. But there's a broader issue here, and I think there is a role for universities, and perhaps that's how state government can actually play a role initially in in supporting our university sector. It's so important, so many jobs, and it is about being a clever state, and our universities are just terrific. I know that many parents have spoken to me as well about wanting to get their kids back to university, and my husband spoke to me about that again this morning, I have to say, because we've got my stepdaughter is living at home now, not at college. But I do think that there are, there is a place for government working directly with universities to actually see that happen. The big issue for me, I come back to, is international students. We've got, it's not just about losing students for 1 year, it's actually about losing students for 4 years. That's the reality for us. And until this government realises that they have terribly let down the community. And you've got to remember that our students, our international students, are the greatest advocates for studying here. They go back, they talk about their experiences, and of course many of them go on to live here and to work here. But you've also got our multicultural groups who are champions of studying here as well, and they are also deeply disappointed about the lack of support, because they have had to step in to support these students. And I thank you, Gabrielle, for being an advocate on this as well, because this government hasn't realised the dire reputational damage that is being done to New South Wales as a result of this failure.
Let me ask you one final question. We've seen protests all over the world for Black Lives Matter, including a very large protest here in Sydney. How do you interpret that? What are your views on what that was about for New South Wales, and what needs to change in response to that, if anything?
Yeah, oh gosh, so much needs to change. It's about equity. That whole protest is about equity. I came out and spoke quite vocally about the fact that there was confusion around people being allowed to march and not march. But the fact is that the reason why they were marching is so important. We see a disproportionate share of Aboriginal people who are incarcerated. I think it's about 25% of those in prison in this state are actually Aboriginal people, and that's shameful. That we carry that, I carry that. We've got a higher mortality rate, we've got a higher teen pregnancy rate. We have so far to go in being able to make sure that there is an equitable policy response, an equitable approach more generally to our Aboriginal people here. And I know this is something that you find quite intriguing as to how that protest occurred here and there, and where that kind of meshed in the middle. You and I have spoken about that. But I think what it says is that people here want great change. We've seen the apology, we've seen that National Sorry Day, people walking across the bridge. But since then, we've achieved some, but we need to achieve so much more. And I think that what that did was highlight that there is still real unsettledness and dissatisfaction with the way that we treat Aboriginal people in this state. And God, we've got to do so much better.
All right, opposition leader, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us. Thank you for being willing to take on such a breadth of topics.
Oh, you're welcome.
Which of course we know you are able to handle. Everybody, thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live, and we'll see you all at the next one.
Bye.